Ukrainian soldiers eliminated a company of Russian occupiers and captured 9 more as a result of combat operations in the vicinity of Vovchansk, Kharkiv region. According to fighters from the 57th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade, the enemy uses the tactic of small infantry groups for assaults. They use drones and carry out strikes with guided aerial bombs. Nevertheless, drone operators from the Merchiki Battalion of Unmanned Systems are clearing out the settlement and the occupiers' shelters. Ukrainian defenders are also continuing to clear Kupyansk. The remaining Russian army personnel there have found themselves completely surrounded and are losing any presence in the city for good. At the same time, on the left bank of the Oskil, they are trying to push Ukrainian forces back across the river but have had no success.
The operation in Kupyansk continues, a counter-sabotage operation. Today, the logistics for the Russians have been completely destroyed, and so far, the occupiers' attempts to restore them have not been successful. They are trying to cross the Oskil River, trying to use heavy drones to drop things in this direction, but Russian forces definitely have no success here. Although it's very clear that the intensity of fighting here is definitely not going to decrease in this direction, because, as I already said, attempts to overcome the Oskil River are ongoing. These are attempts to bring heavy equipment across the crossings, which are being destroyed. The Russian aggressor is also failing at this today.
Meanwhile, in the southern Slobodzhansky direction, the enemy attacked in the areas of the settlements of Volchanskaya Khotora, Svorichanskia, Grigorivka, and Kolodezna. Near Konstantinovka, Ukrainian defenders repelled assaults by the invaders at Alexander Shultine, Plashchievka, and Sofievka. And on the Pokrovsk section of the front, the Russians tried to advance toward the positions of the defense forces near Ivanivka, Kotlin, Udachne, and in the direction of Molodetske.
Those Russians who managed to slip through our firing positions through the front line, they made it in there. In Pokrovsk, we're trying to clear them out. In the city, we're hunting them down. They change into civilian clothes, they hide in basements and destroyed houses. It's quite difficult to quickly find and eliminate or capture all of them there. It's technically challenging. That's the only reason. Everything else is improving logistically. The capabilities, because we constantly have to deliver everything needed for combat operations for sustaining life. For our garrison that's defending Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Kostiantynivka.
Because they can't establish control over Pokrovsk, the Russian occupiers are ramping up pressure on Mirnograd, concentrating about 10 units there. According to the soldiers, capturing this settlement is important for them in order to advance further. The 7th Air Assault Corps. Ukrainian forces have also brought in additional troops and resources there. In particular, the logistical corridors in the western part of the city have been reinforced.
The enemy is trying to attack. Not just attack, but to carry out large-scale offensive operations, as you can see, using heavy equipment as well. It should be noted that the use of armored vehicles is now evident in various directions. Russia is trying to attack in low waves. First, heavy equipment goes in, and then the enemy tries to attack on ATVs and motorcycles. So this kind of light cavalry, motorized cavalry, is trying to go into battle. However, we understand perfectly well that their chances, not just of surviving, but of survival at all, are basically zero.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones attacked the Yefremov synthetic rubber plant at night. In the Tula region, satellite systems recorded explosions and a large fire on the premises. The plant specializes in producing explosives in solid rocket fuel. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has lost more than 1,200,000 military personnel. Just in the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces eliminated 1,090 occupiers and also destroyed 3 tanks, 4 armored combat vehicles, 45 artillery systems, 3 multiple rocket launchers, and 159 units of automotive equipment of the enemy.
Joining us is Nikolai Malamouj, General of the Ukrainian Army and Head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine from 2005 to 2010. Nikolai Grigorievich, we're glad to have you with us. Glory to Ukraine.
Good morning.
Greetings. Glory to the heroes.
Let's start with Kupyansk, and first of all with the political significance of the Kupyansk operation by the armed forces of Ukraine, in the sense that the generals have long since reported to Putin that the city has been taken. Putin put this out there for the Western audience, as well as for his own audience. But as far as I understand, the Kupyansk operation has not only ended successfully, but is also expanding. What is your opinion regarding both the military and political significance of this event?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the fact that this isn't the first time Russian military officials have reported to the dictator Putin about capturing our cities. They've shown flags and even claimed to be present on the streets of Kupyansk and other cities. If we look at the entire front line, there have already been reports about 8 cities, from Vovchansk to Huliaipol, supposedly being captured. Putin has announced this. The issue of Kupyansk was emphasized during several press conferences and at the meeting of the expanded board of the Ministry of Defense. In other words, this was a key PR move by the Russian troops and the dictator himself. This was especially significant in terms of the possible opening of yet another broad offensive front toward the Kharkiv direction. So this failure was systemic because they were unable to capture Kupyansk, or even more so, to carry out operations of various formats from north to south as they had tried. We repelled their strike flanking positions, and of course completely localized the actions of saboteurs in the city. At first, there were up to 200 of them, then 150, and now fewer than 100. There are just a few, literally, representatives of the Russian armed forces, left in basements and houses, without food, practically without any support from the air, like they previously had with drones. We've already neutralized that. We essentially localized this entire breakthrough, which was local, as we say, to the city. That's why in this situation, the military failure is obvious, both in a tactical sense and in terms of the prospects for developing new offensive operations on a broader scale. But most importantly, it's a military political failure. This is what Putin was basing his entire policy on regarding peace negotiations. And those 28 points he presented to the US were accompanied by attacks on our territory and the trump cards he was pulling out of his sleeve. But they turned out to be false, because he had told Trump and the representatives who were in the US in Moscow that he was advancing, that there were already successes in the Kupyansk direction, and that Kupyansk had been captured. He even showed video footage. Vovchansk has been captured, and accordingly, everything, Konstantinovka to the whole thing, the Guyaipole direction, and this entire agglomeration, which is supposedly already under control, almost all the way to Zaporizhia along the perimeter. Well, the Pokrovsko-Krasnogad direction. He was telling Vitkov and Kushner that it's completely under control and accordingly a total failure. That's why Kupyansk is a symbol of this failure. Putin's fake. And yet another failed PR stunt. I remember back in the old days, during the elections when Yushchenko was running, when he congratulated Yanukovych twice. So the same kind of total failure happened with Kupyansk, but back then it didn't have such consequences. But here it has military and political consequences. His trump cards turned out to be fake.
Nikolai Grigorievich, I'd also like to point out something else. Today, many countries around the world, including Ukraine, are celebrating Christmas, and there's talk about a sort of Christmas truce. But let me remind you, this concept first appeared during World War I. There were attempts to somehow integrate this Christmas truce into what's happening here. But as we can see, Russia refused. And against the backdrop of what's happening on the front lines, there's another aspect of this war: the massive shelling, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and energy infrastructure. We can see how the air defense in Odessa is being worn down. This has been going on for a very long time. So overall, considering the fact that the weather is changing, that it's getting much colder, what should we expect in terms of these shellings that the Russian Federation is actively carrying out and refuses to stop under any circumstances?
Putin is trying to dictate his own terms. If he says something about a ceasefire, let's remember, there have been several instances where he declared that for a certain period or day, as he calls it, a victory day, he announces, I'm declaring 3 days, so let's all observe these 3 days. But he likes to dictate even under these conditions of war. Here, I'm imposing my position. So when there was the idea for MERS or others to declare a ceasefire and they appealed to Putin, Putin didn't respond. Instead, he responded with fire. Right now, he needs to show that he's the one in control. That's number one. The fact is, he will continue to carry out attacks without interruption. And Peskov has already stated that there will be no ceasefire for Christmas. In other words, we will continue to carry out terrorist attacks, regardless of any holidays, whether national or international. Just the day before yesterday, the Pope made an appeal to Putin, asking him to stop the fighting for just a day or two. But today, Putin believes he should continue carrying out terrorist attacks, especially at this decisive stage, when the weather is bad and he thinks he can advance, for example, in several directions, like Kontrashovka and Vovchansk, where it's peaceful, for instance. They are already claiming that they are making further gains there. Yes, there are some advances there, but it's a combat situation. Things change there every day. But he thinks that the holidays will be kind of a decisive moment. We'll be relaxing while they'll be advancing, and even more so terrorizing people who are, well, getting ready for the holiday. It's basically, the mindset of a terrorist at this point. Even during the holiday period, when everyone, takes a more lenient stance, not carrying out even acts of war that lead to casualties. A time like the birth of Christ. But he ignores all of that. And here, it's already a sign that the person can't even control himself. In other words, he's so fixated that he's ready to carry out a terrorist attack even during such times, which is exactly what he did last night against Ukrainian civilians across all sectors. Well, obviously at the front lines. He wants to show that if you don't agree, he'll keep carrying out attacks at the front and across all of Ukraine, no matter how many civilian casualties there are. That's the current steps. That's why only united forces, first and foremost the military component, then the political one, meaning Europe, the US, and a number of other countries, active military aid and tough actions against Putin, including intelligence operations and other measures, can weaken his position. The economic component, and of course operational measures as well. There are ways to put pressure on him, but they need to be coordinated together and put the terrorist in his place with systematic, I would even say consolidated, forceful measures. That's the only thing he understands. He personally recognizes and respects strength. He practically ignores any other formats.
I'd like to hear your opinion on the 20 points of the peace plan that President Zelensky announced the other day, and in particular regarding the Kremlin's desire, so to speak, to achieve diplomatically what they couldn't accomplish on the battlefield. I mean, the full intention to seize the territory of Donbass, and President Zelensky's principle, which he voiced as Ukraine's firm stance: we hold the ground where we stand.
Well, first of all, this has been our position for many months now, to stop at the line of demarcation. Since we don't have any effective, victories at the moment, let me be frank, we're working on that. Our soldiers are holding their ground very firmly, and they're working to strengthen their positions, so that, as we say, we have prospects for moving forward. And then, accordingly, Putin won't have any arguments left to say whether he's advancing or holding his ground. But right now, we have an objective, effective position. We'll stop at the line of contact. That's the right position. That's pretty much how it's always been in any war. They would stop at the front line with some minor adjustments. But at the same time, a village might be under mutual control. They'd give up ground here or there, but it was literally just a few hundred meters, no more. But as a general rule, no one gives up territory in any war. All the more so since we're talking about our country, and even the president, in accordance with, by the Constitution, does not have the right to sign off on any transfer of territory, for example in Donetsk region. So it's prohibited both by the Constitution and by logic, and of course by our position in this active war against the aggressor. That's why taking the right position is important. It's the one accepted for negotiations. But I'll say it straight, we should have been pushing for this from the start. It's not them who should be sending us 28 points through the American president. We should be working with them directly. When the position changed, when the United States declared its stance that it supports Ukraine and is ready to provide Tomahawks, we should have kept moving forward from there. But instead, we waited, thinking that was it, that the Americans would now actively help us in a military format. That's when Putin got involved. So it's a tough negotiating position right now, but the initiative should come from Ukraine. We are the country most affected and most interested in this. That's why at this moment, the line of demarcation is the first point. The second component, of course, is security guarantees. But they should be demonstrated first and foremost, and we need to declare them. Zelensky has already spoken about this. We've been preparing for a long time, and the size of the armed forces should be around 600 to 800,000, but closer to 800 is sufficient. When the hostilities end, the army will be highly professional, highly technological, and 5th and 6th generation weaponry will be standard for our troops. Then Putin won't have the opportunity to suddenly attack in advance. This army will be able to act instantly. And at the same time, we're talking about up to 3 million reservists. This is military training. Those who are demobilized will form a reserve that can be back in action within 2 or 3 days. And this 2 or 3 million strong army will be ready to repel any new offensive. Such a mechanism is very effective, and most importantly, is the main guarantee of security. Alongside our partners, with the provision of troops, with intelligence support, an early warning system for possible attacks, and an air defense system. This, of course, is the highly effective work of technical intelligence in terms of detecting even the intentions behind new aggressive plans against Ukraine or against NATO. When we are ready to instantly expand our positions, take up combat positions, deploy, so to speak, all our forces, resources, and combat components, and of course the diplomatic component as well, where a clear agreement will be reached regarding the line of demarcation, security guarantees, and then Russia's commitment not to use force and not to launch new acts of aggression against Ukraine and Europe. So it's a whole set of issues, but the line of demarcation is kind of the initial stage, and that's fair. Here's the second component that Zelensky mentioned, that there are possible formats for a free economic zone in Donetsk region. That's pretty much the most extreme option. I think that if there are no other arguments, then it's necessary to allow for further consultations. But there can't be either the Russian National Guard or Russian police there, because that would be direct occupation. The Russian National Guard is a regular Russian force. Absolutely right, Nikolai Grigorievich. Yes.
Well, it's worth noting that this is still just a draft plan, and there's still quite a bit of serious work to be done on it. Nikolai Grigorievich, thank you for being with us. Nikolai Malamud, General of the Army of Ukraine and head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine from 2005 to 2010, was in touch with our studio.